to the Polgar Chess University. In this lesson, I'd like to share some ideas with you about one of the most common tactical themes, the knight fork. Let's start immediately with a simple but typical example. Here we go. In this position, there is a balanced material situation with white to move. In each of these situations, it's absolutely crucial whose turn it is. If it would be the other side's turn, black's in this case, black wouldn't have a single problem. They would be, in fact, a bit better having a passed pawn on a5. However, in our example, it is white to move. And therefore, white has an amazingly good move by at the same time attacking the black king with the knight, giving a check, as well as black's queen. This is a sad situation for black because since the black king is in check right now, what that means is that the black king needs to move out of the check, and that will give white the time to now capture black's queen. Even though the black rook right now is able to capture white's knight on c8, it will still be a tremendous material gain for white, winning a queen and only losing a knight. Let's move on to our next example. That's gonna be a bit more complex, and that's how this lesson is set up. That first we're gonna see a very basic example where in only one move we are creating a fork, a double attack, and then we follow it up with a bit more complex example on the same exact idea. Let's see our more complex idea in this case. What has changed compared to the previous example? Well, what has changed is that now each side has two rooks, not just one. Also, the same fork, that is to move the knight from d5 to e7, would not make any sense, even though it seems to attack the black king and rook at the same time. The problem is that the black queen will capture the white knight. And then there is no other white piece that would capture the black queen. Also note that the black rook on c8, while it is attacked by white's rook, it is also protected by black's, and therefore that rook is safe, as both rooks are of equal value. Let's go back again to our starting position. Here, white has a smart way to still win material, using exactly the same idea as we saw in our first example. That is, if the black queen would be forced to move to c8, where the rook is right now, that would allow the fork we're already familiar with, knight moving to e7. So what white needs to do in this position needs to first trade rooks. What happens now is that if black does not want to stay a rook behind and captures the white rook, then here we go. We're back to our first example where the white knight moves to e7, checks, and then captures black's queen. Going back to our starting position, and after rook takes rook, you may wonder, but what if the black queen chooses not to capture white's rook right now? Well, then the scenario is simple. For example, if queen moves away to d7 instead of capturing the rook, white has captured a rook. That is, white is a rook ahead right now. So therefore, white already gained material. It's not going to be the queen, but white maintains an extra rook. And now white has plenty of good opportunities, among them to simply trade rooks by rook takes rook, or the rook could, if they wish, simply to retreat somewhere safe along the c file and again maintain the extra rook. Let's move on to our next example, which is going to be in many ways very similar, but yet a completely different position. Here we go. In this position, white has two knights, which black doesn't have any of, while black has an extra rook and pawn. Black has 6 pawns versus white's 5. So what that means is that the two knights give white 2 times 3 points, that is 6 points extra that black doesn't have. On the other hand, black has a rook and an extra pawn, also making it 5 plus 1, 6 points. So the current material balance is completely equal in this position. Again, it's absolutely crucial whose turn it is. And it is white's turn again in this situation. And white has at his disposal a simple but very effective move, which hopefully you can find after seeing our sample in the first and second examples in this lesson. What you're looking for is a double attack, or a fork as we call it, on the black king and queen simultaneously. And that move is moving the knight to f6. This is a check that black needs to react to, and when knight's checks come about, black can never have an option to try to block it. Unlike checks by a bishop or a rook or a queen, when the king may have one of 3 options, in addition to running away, you may capture the attacker or block the check. When you're getting a knight check, you can never ever block. You would only have 2 options. One is to run away with your king, move out from the check, or the second being, if there is an opportunity, to capture the attacking piece. In that case, that would be white's knight on f6. But right here, black does not have such opportunity. So therefore, the black king is forced to move, and then white just wins a clear queen, giving white a devastating advantage. Again, after seeing the basic example, let's move on to a more complex example on the same exact theme. Here we go. As you can see, most of the pieces on the board look identically positioned as in our third example. However, right now, white is not yet quite ready to give a fork. The black queen and king are not sitting in a position that would allow white to fork as he did in the previous example. However, the reason why this is so important, because during a game, as you'll get to play more and more experienced opponents, you will find that they will not fall into simple one-move traps. And that's what I'm trying to introduce, how a basic idea works, and then how in a real game you can follow up on it or set up a trap that your opponent may fall for. In this case, white's correct move is to capture black's bishop with the rook. As we know, the rook is more valuable than the bishop, being 5 points versus the bishop only 3. However, here white on purpose sacrifices an exchange when we give up a rook versus a minor piece such as a knight or a bishop. It's called an exchange sacrifice, with the idea that if now the black queen indeed captures our rook, then here we go into our pattern, allowing knight f6, check, forking black's king and queen. Again, if the white rook captures on d7 and black chooses not to capture but move away with the queen someplace, then what happened was white simply won a bishop, even though black's queen is safe. So our goal is in all of these examples to gain some material advantage, the most that we can. In this case, white made a combination with the idea of using the opportunity for a fork, but of course black had a choice not to go for that, not to fall for that, but instead do some damage control and lose only the bishop and not the queen. Let's move on to our next example, again on the same theme. Although this example is slightly different from the previous four, and I'll tell you why. In the previous four examples, what we saw was the white knight checked the black king in order to achieve a fork. In the example we see in front of us right now, it will be still a knight fork, however, it will not be involving a check. White in this case will attack two very strong black pieces, the two strongest ones, that is the black queen and the black rook on c3. The way to achieve that is to move the knight back to e4, and from here the knight on one hand attacks the queen and on the other the rook on c3. What typically happens in such situations, just as if this move would be a check, one piece can only move away, and then the other one can be captured. In this case, the best black can do is to move the queen onto a square where it at least protects the rook. So after the knight captures the rook, black does not lose a rook for completely nothing, but at least gets to recapture the white knight. White still has gained significant material advantage as the difference between a rook and a knight is 2 points. So this was a 2-point gain for white. Let's see the more complex version of the same example. Again, as you can see, most of the position is the same as position number 5. However, here there is an additional pair of rooks on the board. You may wonder, can white just do the same thing and move the knight to e4 to attack the black queen and the black rook at the same time? They certainly can, but I would not recommend to do it. In fact, it would be a rather poor choice, because here black can do better than moving their queen away from the attack. And that would be called an intermediate move, as black is not reacting to a serious threat when his queen got attacked. Black here would be able to make an intermediate check, and in fact, by capturing white's rook, black would be gaining significant material themselves. So therefore, we know the idea, but we need to refine it just a bit to make sure it works tactically. So what white needs to do right here, right now, is to capture the black rook first. Right now, white is a rook ahead, and in fact is threatening the second black rook as well. And if black captures back on c3, then here we go. We created the same idea we saw in our previous example, allowing the white knight to move to e4 and win an exchange, that is, winning 2 points. Let's follow up and move on to our next example. Here we go. Again, based on our previous example so far, hopefully you can figure out relatively quickly on your own what white should do right now. In this lesson, our hero is the knight. So therefore, you have another hint. You know you want to look for a knight move that would attack two of the most valuable pieces that you know of. Therefore, the correct move right now for white is to move the knight to d7. What happens now is black is in a check, and also the black queen is under attack. So what that means, the black king needs to move, no other choice, and then the white knight can capture on the following move the black queen. Again, let's move on to the more complex example of the same. Here we go. In this position, there is no immediate way to fork. And if the white knight would move to d7 now, attacking only the queen could simply move away and be in the game. So what white needs to do in this case, white needs to do a tricky move that would invite the black king onto that fork situation that we just saw in our previous example. And the way to achieve that is to use our rook to attack the black king. As you know, an attack on the king is an absolute. That means the opponent needs to react to it. It cannot just make any random move that they would like to. Black has two ways to react to this attack. Either to simply move the king, which as we already know would result in the same problem, allowing the fork and then losing the queen. Or the other option would be to interpose to block the check. Objectively speaking, queen to a7 is the better choice because in that case, black, after losing the queen, will at least get white's rook in turn. In contrary to if black would have walked out of the check to b8 with the king and allowing the fork. So this would be a situation of damage control. Of course, as black, you prefer not to get into situations as such. However, if you already see the trouble coming, try to cut the losses and try to lose as little material as possible. Let's see our next example. Here we go. In this endgame, black is a pawn ahead at the moment. And if it were black's turn, black would be in an excellent shape, having the opportunity to defend against the threat. But in our case, it is white's turn. And here the solution is not terribly complicated. The white knight can simply move to c7, check the black king, and at the same time attack black's rook as well, which means that the black king needs to move out of the check, and then knight takes rook resulted in a significant gain for white. Let's follow up on the more complex version of the same endgame. Here we go. Well, it's the same material we have on the board, but as you can see, the white knight and the black king are positioned slightly differently than they were in our previous example. In this case, what white needs to achieve is to get the same exact position that we had in our last example, because that means that the black king and rook will be in an unfortunate position where white can fork those two black pieces. The way to do that is to play knight b5 check. Thanks to the cooperation of the white rook along the 6th rank, the black king cannot move up there and needs to move back down to a8. And now, here we are in our same exact position that we saw earlier, position number 9, where the white knight moves to c7, checks, and then captures the black rook on d5. Let's see our next example, where the sacrifice will be the black bishop. Here again, the task is to figure out how can the white knight attack two enemy pieces at the same time. When you would have more than one such option, you obviously are trying to attack two of the most valuable pieces. So in this case, it's the black king, because that's always an absolute threat when you're attacking the king. And then the next most valuable piece in our current position is the black bishop on c5. Therefore, the correct move is knight to e6 check. And as usual, the king needs to move, and then knight takes bishop, gaining 3 points for white. And again, let's see the follow-up example. In this position, as you can see, there are an extra pair of rooks on the board compared to our previous example. Also, it's quite important to notice, as always, what does our opponent want to do? And here we need to be aware of the fact that the black rook is targeting the white rook. Even though the white knight protects it at the moment, we need to be aware of that situation. Because, for example, if white right now would want to move the knight away to e6, trying to create a double attack, a fork, on black's rook and bishop, the big problem would be that the black rook would come first and capture our rook, moreover with a check, and then the bishop would be free to run away, and white would be the one losing a whole entire rook. So therefore, what white needs to do right now is to first exchange the pair of rooks. If black does not recapture with the king, then white just remains up an extra rook. And when the black king recaptures, then we achieved our previous example, and here we go, white is ready to fork. Let's move on to a very similar example. Here we go. Here again, white needs to look for the double attack where the black king and bishop will be attacked. I'm sure after seeing all these examples, you'll have an easy time figuring that out. And that move is moving the knight to b6, check, and then to capture the bishop. And the more complex version of the same, here we go. In this position, it is white's turn. Again, moving the knight to b6 right away would not be the answer, because then black would capture the white rook. On the other hand, if white first trades rook with a check, and when king recaptures, then again we achieved our goal and fork, winning the bishop. You may wonder what would happen if after rook takes rook, the king captures the knight on d7 instead. Well, in that case, white simply won an exchange again, because white has captured a rook, while black only a knight. And here are our final pair of examples. Here is the simple version, where white can simply create an immediate fork by attacking black's king and rook. When you're looking for a fork, you always want to start what are the two most valuable pieces that you can attack in one go. And that answer would be by playing knight d5. Check, attacking the king and the rook at the same time. King moves out of the check, and then knight takes rook. And finally, our last example in this lesson, the more complex version of the same. Here, white is able to capture black's rook in one move, but that would not be the answer, because black immediately would capture our rook, and therefore that only would be a fair exchange. White can do better than that in this case, by making a temporary sacrifice by capturing black's bishop, If black does not capture now white's rook, white just won a bishop. On the other hand, if they do, then here we are again, resulting in the previous example, knight d5, fork, and then capturing black's rook. White comes out ahead, being up an extra knight in this position. Well, I hope you learned some from these very instructive examples, and you can use them soon in your own games. Look out for all those knight forks. They are there in many times in your games. Just need to look for them. I hope this helped. Thank you for listening, and so long until next time.